The monarchy provides, with the Constitution, a degree of long-term stability.
The death of Queen Elizabeth didn't just crown a new king. It cracked open old wounds, hidden fears, and a royal house on the edge of unraveling. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, the world mourned the end of an era. But within the palace walls, something even more profound began to unravel. Her death didn't just signal the close of a reign, it triggered the slow disintegration of everything she had quietly held together. At the center of that storm stood King Charles III, a man who had waited longer than any other heir in British history. But when the crown finally rested on his head, it didn't bring the triumph he had spent a lifetime preparing for. Instead, it weighed heavy with unseen cracks, political doubt, and personal fear. Behind the royal pageantry, Charles was quietly fighting a private battle, one far more terrifying than any royal duty. Shortly after his ascension, whispers began surfacing. His health, already fragile, had worsened. The palace kept the details under lock and key, but insiders knew something was wrong. Charles was fading not just from the public stage, but from within. Reports of fatigue and weight loss were brushed off, yet each appearance showed a man less vibrant, more distant. The same cameras that once captured his stately poise now revealed eyes dulled by exhaustion and a figure slowly withering beneath ceremonial robes. Beneath the surface, the king had been diagnosed with cancer, but the specifics were hidden behind tradition and secrecy. To the outside world, he continued his duties, putting on a brave face. But behind closed doors, the tension was thick. Senior royals noticed his speeches shortening, his public engagements dropping, his energy waning. The man who had trained his entire life for the throne was unraveling beneath its weight. The crown that symbolized authority and endurance now seemed more like a chain. His reign, which was meant to bring modern reform, began instead with retreat and silence. The royal family, fractured by scandal, loss, and estrangement, looked to him for unity. But Charles was fading, and the very institution he now led began to tremble under the pressure. Behind the palace walls, anxiety rippled through the staff. Discussions that were once about royal engagements turned to succession, contingency plans, and what might come next. Would the monarchy survive another blow? Could Charles fulfill his legacy, or was he already passing into history before leaving a mark? The room grew colder, more uncertain. With every day, the king remained unseen. But even as the court stumbled and the public grew uneasy, someone else in the shadows never flinched. And amid this royal decay, one quiet figure stands unshaken: Princess Anne. While others performed royalty, she lived it. Not for attention, but for duty. In a world where crowns shine and cameras chase every gesture, Princess Anne chose a different path, one forged in silence, service, and sheer resolve. While her brothers and nephews found themselves tangled in headlines or ceremony, Anne remained untouched by the chaos. She didn't need to prove her place within the monarchy. She earned it with every handshake, every ribbon cut, every backroom conversation that never made the news. To the outside world, she was often overlooked, but inside the palace walls, her presence was unshakable, constant, dependable, and quietly revered. From her earliest days, Anne refused the velvet cushion that royalty offered. She didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't hunger for applause. She embraced hard work, riding horses in the cold, visiting the forgotten corners of the Commonwealth, and showing up not for the photographs, but for the people. Her diary was notoriously packed, her travel relentless. But she never complained. She wore her title like armor and kept walking. Over the decades, she became a quiet force within a royal family battered by scandals and shifting public loyalties. Where others faltered, she endured. And King Charles took notice. As his strength waned and the weight of his crown grew heavier, Charles leaned more and more on the one person who never asked anything of him in return. Not Camilla, not his sons. It was Anne, the sister who had stood behind him in silence, never needing credit, never asking for acknowledgement. She became his anchor during the storm, the one person he could confide in when the cameras were off and the corridors echoed with uncertainty. Anne listened without judgment, advised without ego, and carried his burdens like they were her own. In a monarchy built on hierarchy, she rose not by inheritance, but by sheer merit. And then came the moment. That solemn, unspoken handoff no one outside the family saw coming. Behind tightly closed doors, the king handed her something more sacred than any title of final request: his dying wish. It wasn't written on royal parchment or declared before ministers. It was shared in the soft, exhausted voice of a brother who knew his time was running out. He asked Anne to be the messenger of his truth, the keeper of a legacy he might never fully realize. He entrusted her with a task that only she could carry out, a task that would quietly steer the future of the crown when he no longer could. And that task would reshape the future, but it would break her nephew first. It wasn't supposed to be dramatic, but when Princess Anne stood up, the room changed. It was a cold, private morning in early 2025, far from the eyes of the press, the cameras, and the world. At Sandringham, the royal family had gathered quietly without formal announcements, without any hint to the public that something profound was about to unfold. They were there out of duty, yes, but also out of worry. King Charles, though still alive, was no longer leading. His absence from the gathering said more than words ever could. The monarch, who once stood tall and articulate, was now too frail to attend what would become one of the most defining moments of his reign. Prince William sat alongside Catherine, surrounded by the familiar yet tension-thick faces of the royal inner circle. Conversations were polite, restrained, as if no one wanted to admit what they all sensed. This was not just another family reunion. It felt like the final breath of an era. No one had expected much more than shared concern and hushed updates on the king's condition. But then, without prompt or ceremony, Princess Anne rose from her seat. Her posture was firm, her voice unwavering. And with that single movement, the temperature in the room dropped. She wasn't speaking as a sister. She wasn't even speaking as a royal. In that moment, she was the voice of the king. In carefully measured words, she delivered a message so intimate and personal that it cut through the silence like a blade. This wasn't about titles or appearances. It wasn't about duty or formality. This was about legacy, about what would happen to the monarchy after Charles, something none of them had wanted to face until now. The king's final wish, entrusted only to Anne, was laid bare. And it wasn't about him. It was about the future, about stability, about who could be trusted to carry the crown not just in blood, but in spirit. He had named Catherine, not as a figurehead, not as a background consort, but as the steady heart of the monarchy's future. Anne spoke with reverence, recounting how both Charles and Queen Elizabeth had seen something in Catherine that no title could bestow: a grace under pressure, a calm that outlasted chaos, a strength that didn't need to shout. Charles had quietly watched her through the years, noticing how she endured scandals, supported William without faltering, and carried herself with the dignity that his mother once embodied. For a moment, no one spoke. William sat still, eyes fixed, lips pressed, but something inside him shifted. He wasn't blindsided by the choice. He had leaned on Catherine more times than he could count. But to hear it spoken aloud, acknowledged by his father as royal truth, was different. It forced him to confront a deeper reality. His wife was no longer just beside him. She was being asked to guide the crown itself. There was no applause, no emotional outbursts, just the heavy quiet of realization settling over every corner of the room. Catherine, so often in the background, had just become the pillar of the future. Not through ambition, but through undeniable presence. And William, grateful, shaken, and proud, felt the crown shift subtly between their shoulders. But why Catherine? What did she do to earn such trust? She wasn't born royal, but every challenge shaped her into one. Long before the palace gates opened to her, Catherine Middleton was navigating a world defined by quiet strength and relentless determination. Born into a family that balanced tradition with ambition, she didn't grow up with titles or tiaras, but with values. Her parents, rooted in middle-class work ethic, instilled in her the idea that respect is earned, not inherited. While some saw her as an outsider when she stepped into royal circles, Those who truly looked closer could already see it. She carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that couldn't be taught. Her early years reflected a young woman unafraid to challenge herself. Whether it was studying at top schools, thriving on the hockey field, or adapting to life overseas in Jordan as a child, Catherine proved that she was capable of stepping into any world and holding her own. She didn't need grandeur to find purpose. Her academic journey led her to the University of St. Andrews, where, fatefully, she crossed paths with Prince William. But even then, her focus remained grounded. While others might have chased the fairy tale, Catherine chose restraint, patience, and the long game. She knew that anything worth having demanded something in return. And when her relationship with William pushed her into the public eye, the pressure was immediate and unrelenting. Cameras followed her every move. Headlines questioned her intentions, and critics waited for her to stumble. But she never flinched. She didn't fight back with outrage. She didn't play the victim. Instead, she adapted. She endured. Her transition into royal life wasn't a grand transformation. It was a slow, steady evolution marked by grace under pressure. She observed. She learned. And most importantly, she never let the spectacle distract her from the substance. That quiet fortitude didn't go unnoticed. Queen Elizabeth, a woman who reigned through decades of turbulence, saw in Catherine a reflection of herself, calm, disciplined, and deeply committed to duty over drama. King Charles, too, recognized something powerful in her restraint. Catherine didn't seek attention, but her consistency made her indispensable. She wasn't loud. She wasn't performative. But when crisis struck, she was always there, offering strength without noise, leadership without ego. To the public, she was elegant. To the family, she was the glue that held them together when everything else was falling apart. And for William, she became more than a partner. She was his mirror and his foundation. In moments when the future of the monarchy felt uncertain, it wasn't William's crown that brought calm, it was Catherine's presence. A presence that didn't need royal blood to command respect. It only needed integrity. But that strength would soon face its greatest test, one that changed everything. She vanished from the spotlight. The silence screamed louder than words. In early 2024, the world noticed something strange. Princess Catherine, the ever-composed and ever-present force in the royal family, disappeared from public view. There were no statements, no appearances, no hints of when she'd return. The palace released a carefully worded message about a planned abdominal surgery and a standard recovery. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks slipped into months, concern turned into speculation. Something wasn't right. The woman who had stood firm through scandal, loss, and transition was simply gone. And in that silence, the world began to worry. Royal observers, journalists, and fans across the globe were left in the dark. William canceled engagements. Senior royals tiptoed around questions, and the public used to Catherine's unwavering presence felt the void deeply. There were no photographs, no video messages, just a single, growing question that echoed louder with each passing day. Where is she? The mystery invited rumors, but those closest to her knew better. This wasn't about hiding. This was about surviving. Something far more personal and terrifying was unfolding behind the palace walls. And then came March 2025, a moment that no one could have prepared for. In a single, short video message, Catherine reappeared seated simply, her voice soft yet steady. She didn't deliver a royal statement. She spoke as a mother, a wife, a woman. With quiet bravery, she revealed the truth. She had cancer. She was undergoing preventive chemotherapy. And though her words were measured, the weight they carried shattered the hearts of millions. It was the first time many truly saw her not just as the Princess of Wales, but as a human being in pain. But instead of fear, Catherine radiated calm. Instead of self-pity, she offered gratitude for her family, for her doctors, for the outpouring of kindness from those who waited so patiently. She didn't hide the hardship. She didn't sugarcoat the fight. And in doing so, she gave strength to countless others walking through their own battles. Her illness didn't diminish her, it elevated her. In a world obsessed with perfect images, Catherine showed the power of vulnerability, the courage to be real. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages flooded in from every continent. Cancer survivors, grieving families, young women, world leaders, they all saw something in Catherine that transcended royalty. She had become something more than a duchess, more than a future queen. She had become a symbol of hope. And not through ceremony, but through raw truth. Her ability to balance dignity with honesty reshaped how the public saw her. She wasn't just enduring cancer. She was leading through it. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was offering strength. And as the world saw her strength, the palace saw something else, a future queen not in name, but in command. Every step she took in the background led her straight to the center. Catherine was never one to demand the spotlight, but slowly, steadily, she earned it. While others chased headlines, she built something quieter, deeper. A legacy not of fanfare, but of impact. From the very beginning of her royal journey, she showed a unique understanding that power isn't just about titles, but about service. And she chose to wield hers with intention. Mental health, childhood development, community well-being, these weren't side projects. They were the pillars of her mission. With unwavering focus, she transformed her platform into a force for real change. And in doing so, she became far more than a royal partner. She became a symbol of modern monarchy. Heads together, shaping us. These weren't token campaigns attached to her name for prestige, they were personal. Catherine dug into these initiatives with the depth of someone who didn't just want to appear informed, she wanted to understand, to learn, to fix what had been broken for too long. She met with parents, listened to teachers, sat with children in crisis. Her work with the Royal Foundation didn't stop at appearances. She shaped programs, influenced policies, and created measurable change. No detail was too small, no conversation too quiet. She was there for it all present, engaged, and fiercely committed. This wasn't the work of a ceremonial figure. This was the quiet labor of a leader. She didn't give speeches for the applause. She gave them to move people to act. When Catherine stepped into a room, she wasn't just the Duchess. She was the voice of causes that had been ignored for far too long. And with each passing year, her influence deepened. Charities that had once struggled now thrived. Conversations that were once taboo, like mental health in children, became national priorities, not because of a royal decree, but because of her persistence. Behind palace doors, the shift was unmistakable. Catherine was no longer being seen as just William's wife or the future queen consort. She was leading with such clarity and conviction that even the most traditional voices began to acknowledge the obvious. She wasn't trailing behind royalty. She was redefining it. To the public, she became a symbol of compassion without spectacle, strength without ego. In a world desperate for authenticity, she delivered it without asking for praise. And the world responded. Polls shifted. Public trust grew. Headlines changed tone. She wasn't just supporting the crown, she was reinforcing it. Quietly, Catherine had become the monarchy's strongest pillar. But not everyone viewed her rise with admiration. Because while she was lifting a nation's hopes, she was also stirring something more dangerous, doubt. But this rising star was casting a long shadow, and not everyone could ignore it. He stood beside her in public, but in private, he questioned everything. For years, Prince William was seen as the steady hand guiding the monarchy's future. Groomed since childhood to inherit the crown, he walked with the weight of destiny on his shoulders. But as Catherine's star rose, something unexpected began to take shape, a shift in perception that left William standing in the shadow of the woman he loved most. At first, he welcomed it. Her strength made him stronger. Her grace elevated them, both. But slowly, as public admiration deepened and the palace began to quietly recalibrate, William felt something shift inside him. His role, once so clearly defined, started to blur. The media no longer focused solely on his leadership. They followed Catherine's initiatives, quoted her speeches, analyzed her influence with a fascination once reserved only for heirs. Polls showed a growing public preference. In interviews and headlines, she was no longer just the wife of the future king. She was the future itself. Advisors began to position her as the monarchy's emotional anchor. Diplomats found her presence disarming. Even the queen consort, Camilla, offered more visible praise. To the world, it was a story of evolution. But to William, it was a quiet erosion. He never said it aloud, never let it show. But behind palace smiles and rehearsed statements, there were moments when the pressure cracked his composure. Was he still seen as the leader? Or had he become the man beside the throne? The public didn't see the late-night discussions, the restless pacing, or the tension that occasionally flickered in his eyes during events where Catherine took center stage. Rumors began to swirl, not of confrontation, but of distance. Not of anger, but of doubt. He loved her deeply. He admired her endlessly. But admiration can coexist with insecurity, and that contradiction began to gnaw at him. He remembered his mother's struggle with visibility, how the crown demanded perfection but punished presence. He feared repeating the same cycle, being overshadowed, misunderstood, or ultimately displaced. And though Catherine had never once stepped out of bounds, her influence grew so naturally that even William couldn't deny it. He didn't resent her, but he feared being left behind by the very future they were meant to shape together. He wasn't just the heir anymore. He was the man walking beside a queen in all but name, and the world was beginning to notice. And that fear came crashing down the moment Anne spoke his father's final words. He didn't crown her with jewels. He crowned her with trust. It wasn't a royal proclamation or a ceremonial decree. It wasn't sealed with tradition or surrounded by applause. It was spoken softly, privately by a dying king who understood that his final act of leadership wasn't to choose a successor, but to secure a future. Charles's dying wish had nothing to do with power. It was about something far more fragile: stability, legacy, continuity. And he entrusted that not to William alone, but to the one person who had proven time and again that royalty was earned, not inherited: Catherine. In the quiet hush of the royal gathering, Princess Anne's words hung in the air with the weight of a kingdom behind them. Charles had asked her to speak for him, to deliver the message he no longer had the strength to say aloud. And when she did, no one could ignore its meaning. Catherine wasn't just the supportive wife. She wasn't just the Princess of Wales. She was the stabilizing force of the monarchy itself. The king's wish was clear, that Catherine not stand behind William, but beside him. Not to follow, but to lead with him. And that changed everything. William's heart broke not because his father had shown preference, but because he saw with painful clarity what he had feared and known all along. Catherine wasn't just admired, she was trusted deeply, unquestionably. And that trust now carried the future of the crown. His implosion wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it was internal, a collision of grief, pride, love, and uncertainty. Because to accept the king's dying wish wasn't to lose his role, it was to admit that his reign, when it came, might not be the one he had imagined. It might not even feel like his alone. The monarchy, once defined by singular rule, now faced a transformation. One shaped by balance, by partnership, and more importantly, by a woman whose calm resolve and tireless devotion had slowly rewritten the expectations of royalty. The queen consort in waiting had become, in many eyes, a queen already. And while tradition whispered that power belonged to the crown, reality now echoed a deeper truth. Power belonged to whoever could hold the nation's trust. For decades, William had carried the burden of being next. But in that moment, he realized that carrying it alone was no longer the answer. His father didn't just hand him the keys to the kingdom, he handed him Catherine. Not to follow, not to flatter, but to stand at the front, together. But will the crown survive a monarchy that follows the Queen's grace over the King's command? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.